Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Robotic Process Automation, your GDPR Hero. I'm Teresa Resick, the Director of Webinars here at AIM, and AIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are Reynold Lemming of InformU Solutions and Dermot McCauley of Kofax. And Kofax is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started, I just wanted to share a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. And across the bottom of your screen is a list of all of the widgets that we have available to you. Group Chat is one of those widgets, and just open that by clicking on that Group Chat icon. And in there, you'll be able to text, communicate with each other, and also with a few of us here at AIM. So feel free to open that up and join in on the conversation. Do ask questions of the speakers throughout our time using the Q&A feature, and that's to the left of the slide area. We will hold these questions until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them. You can also use this feature to ask for technical assistance. You may download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list, and that's to the right of the slide area. And there are also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Just click in there at any time, and that resource will open in a new browser tab, and you'll be able to save that off and read it after the webinar. And at the conclusion of the webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and it's also in the widgets in the slide area. I love those little widgets for you. We appreciate it if you would take a few moments to offer your feedback with that survey and to suggest other topics for us to cover. And we are recording this webinar, and it will be posted to AIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. So now I'd like to introduce our two speakers that we will have with us. Very pleased to have both of them here. Reynold Lemming is the owner and managing director of InformU Solutions, who provide information asset register solutions. Reynold is an independent consultant specializing in information governance and records management. He is also a frequent speaker and educator on a variety of information governance topics, including practical steps for GDPR compliance. Reynold is also the conference director of the UK Information and Records Management Society. And Dermot McCauley is the vice president of platform product marketing at Kofax. He helps Kofax customers realize the potential of robotic process automation and other Kofax digital transformation technologies. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to Dermot McCauley to begin our discussion today. Dermot?
Teresa, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Very pleased to have you join myself and Reynold today. I'm going to begin by briefly running through a reminder of the key requirements that GDPR puts on all of our organizations. I'll then pass to Reynold, who will speak about what it takes to have that insight into personal data that you do need in order to comply to GDPR, and then I'll come back to talk about Robotic Process Automation, RPA, and how that can indeed be your GDPR hero. And I'll conclude with some additional remarks on how you can design for compliance upfront. I expect Reynold and I in those 4 topics to take approximately 30 minutes. And then, as Teresa said, we hope to be able to have lots of questions for you in the last 10 minutes or so. We are going to run 2 instant polls in the course of the first 30 minutes, so please do be ready to participate, not only in Q&A but in those polls. So let's talk about the requirements of GDPR. Essentially, GDPR obligates you to know what personal data you hold, why you hold it, where it's held, who has access to it, and a lot more. And it's been released since May 2016, but in force as of May 2018, the GDPR regulation, and it applies to data held, personal data held on EU citizens, and not only by those companies and organizations who are resident or based or headquartered in the EU, but all companies globally. So this is a right and a regulation to which companies across the entire globe need to pay attention. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because the penalties for non-compliance are harsh. As you can see, these include fines of up to 20 million euros, or in the case of an undertaking or business, finds up to 4% of the total worldwide annual turnover or revenue. So this has huge impact or potential impact if you're unable to comply. But what specifically are the rights that you must provide to EU citizens, and that if you don't, you are subject to this kind of penalty? We've created this simple slide just to bring to the surface for your attention some of the most important in a simple tabular form. I'll read some of the highlights and give you enough time to yourself read these as I do that. Citizens have the right to be informed of what data is held, how it's held, and what other data is used alongside it in processing. They also have the right to what's called rectification, essentially meaning that any of us on the phone here in the EU as citizens could call our bank, insurance company, or government department and request that some incorrect information be corrected or that it be completed if it's incomplete. There's also a right to erasure, and commonly this has been spoken of as the right to be forgotten. And essentially it means that we can again get in touch with our provider and ask for some personal data to be removed. And the last one I'll call out on this page is the right to data portability. That allows each of us to request copies of personal data held on us for use elsewhere. So if, for example, I were applying for a financial product across a number of vendors, I could ask my current bank to provide me with all the personal data that they hold. And the question is, are you prepared really to provide these rights today? And that really is what we're going to ask in our instant first poll. So before Reynold comes to talk about getting insight into the personal data you hold, I'd like to invite you to participate in this first instant poll. And Teresa, perhaps you could help the audience with some guidance on how to do so.
Oh, most certainly. Just come up to your keyboards and click the answer that best applies to you. How prepared is your organization today for GDPR compliance? Do you believe that you're fully prepared, 75% prepared, only halfway there at 50%, 25% prepared, or even less than that, that you're just at the starting blocks? So just go on up there and make the selection of where you feel your organization is in this spectrum in preparing for GDPR. And we're going to take a look at the answers together, and that's where I'm going to invite Reynold Lemming, our next speaker, to come in. And Reynold, I'm looking at these results, and I'm encouraged that there's 12.5% feel that they are fully prepared for this. And how are you, from your customer base and the people that you talk with and assist in getting ready for GDPR, is this about the spectrum of what you're expecting this close to the May date? Reynold, I believe you might still be on mute.
I think so. Sorry, Teresa. Hi. I think so, and I guess our audience is probably largely closely involved in preparing for GDPR compliance, and it's refreshing and reassuring to see these figures. I think the main thing is probably our audience also know, though, of course, is GDPR isn't just for Christmas, and it's about maintaining privacy within your processes and systems and approaches on an ongoing basis. It's going to be absolutely key and as important as the initial readiness for compliance.
Well, Reynold, why don't you go ahead and continue to share what you were going to be speaking on today.
Thanks very much, Teresa, and indeed welcome and hello, everyone. I've got just a few slides, and what I want to focus on in these are some of the practical considerations, but also complexities of handling personal data under GDPR. And the intent of these slides really is to illustrate that a lot of these things can only be done when you've got a detailed insight into personal data through audits and the construction of a data inventory, but also importantly through the clever and ongoing use of RPA, Robotic Process Automation tools. So on the first slide, what I want to explore is a fundamental key to compliance is the business as usual adherence to the principles of the GDPR as stated within Article 5 of the regulation. So I'm going to run through each one of those in turn. What you're going to see on screen, by the way, are my own summaries of those principles. The text within the GDPR itself, Article 5, is of course much more detailed. The first principle is when you're processing personal data, it's about lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And what this really means is keeping people informed. It's keeping people informed before you collect their information through things like privacy notices, through the information you provide on consent forms about what you're going to collect, why you're doing it, what you're going to do with it, how long you're going to keep it, etc. But it's also keeping people informed on request. And we saw Dermot earlier run through the list of increased rights that data subjects such as ourselves have under GDPR. So it's been able to inform people on request when, for example, they put in a data subject access request. The second principle is purpose limitation. We've got to do with people's personal data only what we said that we'd do or what they've given consent for, and that we can't go off and reuse that data for other things that people don't know that it's going to be used for. And allied to that is the third principle, which is data minimization. When someone's consented, when we collect personal data for a valid purpose, we've still got to make sure that we only collect and keep what is strictly needed to undertake that process with their personal data. The fourth principle is accuracy, and Dermot alluded this to with the right to rectification. We've got to make sure that data is accurate and kept up to date, not only at the time of collection, but also as business as usual as part of ongoing processes. The next principle, storage limitation. This is the one about retention and disposal. This is the one about the right to be forgotten. But it's also important, I think, really one of the key things that I've seen GDPR drive is having corporate retention schedules, having retention and disposal undertaken on a business as usual basis, particularly in identifying the personal data sets that perhaps accidentally were being kept for too long before. However, I think it's also important not to end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And in the press at the moment, we're seeing a lot of talk about the accidental maybe destruction by the Home Office of the landing cards for the people on the Windrush and other ships coming from the Caribbean. I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true or not, but there is, shall we say, a rumour that perhaps this happened in so-called preparation for GDPR, because people thought, oh, here's some personal data we don't need to keep, but actually it's really important in terms of the rights and obligations of those particular citizens. So as I say again, and I'll be talking more about retention, be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but equally, particularly where personal data is only processed on the basis of consent, not to keep it for too long. The next principle is about integrity and confidentiality. And this is important because information security is writ large throughout the GDPR, but it's also important to think about business continuity and the word protecting the integrity of personal data. So it's looking at both security and business continuity. And if you look at the definitions of, for example, data loss within the GDPR, yes, it is about things like data theft, but it's also about, for example, the loss of access to key personal data that we need to use if, for example, there is a disaster event. And last but not least, what the GDPR introduces and writes large throughout is the principle of accountability. People have to take responsibility for how they process personal data and keep the records and audit trails to be able to demonstrate on an ongoing basis their compliance with the Act and these principles. And that includes specifically within Article 30 of the GDPR, an article that says you've got to keep, both as a controller and a processor, records of processing activities. And again, I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So what this demonstrates so far, I think, is in order to adhere to these principles, you need to understand the detail of what personal data you process, its characteristics, and the rationale for processing. So staying with that rationale and moving on to the next slide, processing basis for personal data. In the previous slide, I mentioned lawfulness and legitimacy. And within Article 6 of the GDPR for personal data, you've got to choose one or more conditions relating to the lawfulness of your processing. Now, as it says in bold at the bottom of the slide, for special categories of data, the more sensitive data as defined within the GDPR, there are additional bases for processing within Article 9. And as at the same time as the GDPR, we've got the EU Law Enforcement Directive coming out, and national legislation, such as our own United Kingdom Data Protection Bill, that's passing through Parliament, will, for law enforcement and criminal justice organisations, have further legal bases in turn that they must attribute to when they're processing personal data and special categories of data. But that said, what I want to focus on at the moment are the 6 bases of legal consent that are stipulated in Article 6. And in running through these are some key things, I think, for revisiting the retention and disposal policies as well that we attribute to personal data. So the first one is consent. Is the basis on which we collect and process this data just on consent, or are there other considerations as well? The second one is performance of a contract, and a lot of the data that we process is in performance of a contract, or as the detail of the law says, also if we're in the process of entering into a contract. And yes, for example, this is obviously in terms of our contracts with suppliers and with customers, but also typically, the nature of a relationship between an organisation and its employee is one of an ordinary contract. So therefore, actually, a lot of employee data we will base on the retention periods, typically derived from limitation periods that we assign to contract records. The third one is compliance with a legal obligation. And as we know, there's lots and lots of law out there that includes specific record types where they detail retention periods for, whether this is company law, financial law, personnel law, health and safety law, pension law, specific industry law, etc. The others include protecting the vital interests of that person. Are we making sure that we've got the records when it's our responsibility to look after someone's health, to look after someone's well-being, or indeed perhaps their long-term entitlements to things like benefits and pensions? The next one is the lawful function of a public body. Public sector governmental organisations have to do certain things and therefore have to process people's personal data. And last is legitimate interests. And this is an interesting one, because this is what I'm reading a lot of chat on the web about, where people are seeking perhaps legitimate interests is where they can derive a rationale for the ongoing processing of marketing and customer service data. So taking into account the considerations that we've looked at in the first slide, what I next want to do is look at some of the practical things from an information governance and records management perspective that we need to do day to day to make sure that we're complying with GDPR. First of all, throughout the entire life cycle of a business process that handles personal data, from the time it's first collected through its use and storage and perhaps ultimate disposition, we need to make sure that we are legal as to doing the various things. Have we got the right consents? Have we applied the retention policies? Are we keeping this stuff securely? We need to make sure that we're not just reactive, but that we're proactive, particularly in what I call the husbandry of data. So 2 examples would be making sure that we are keeping stuff accurate and up to date, or making sure that we are applying our retention and disposal policies. The third area is ensuring the ongoing security, not just of electronic data, but physical data as well. And within Article 32 of the GDPR, where it talks about security, it talks about both technical and organisational security measures. So we've got to look at security in the round, and equally, as I was alluding earlier in the principle about integrity and confidentiality, we've also got to make sure that we've got the right and robust business continuity measures in place for personal data. We've got to make sure, looking back at all those data subject rights, we quite rightly have, that Dermot identified, that we can easily identify and access personal data to respond to data subject rights and requests. For example, to rectification in response to a data subject access request, or perhaps a data portability request. We've got to make sure as well that we've got a robust data supply chain. Data doesn't just stay with us, it moves. We can be processors or controllers, working with other controllers or processors, or other recipients of that personal data, such as government agencies. And what we've got to do is make sure that we have the processes in place where privity is built in by design and default and other concepts in GDPR, so that we can share data routinely, but on a systematically governed basis. And last but not least, we've got to remain accountable. As I say, GDPR and everything we do isn't just for Christmas. So if we do a data audit, we've got to make sure that inventory remains evergreen, and that whatever we do with personal data, we keep an ongoing audit trail of key business events related to that information, such as, for example, destruction activities that occur. So, a lot of these things, I hope that organisations are able to do. A lot of this is actually just good records management, business as usual, but a lot of it as well, equally, we really do need a good insight to personal data to be able to achieve this. And that's because we have a real challenge that actually we have not only lots and lots of data, but lots and lots of personal data. If we look at the quote that I've taken from the GDPR at the bottom there, it identifies that actually at the moment the definition of personal data within the GDPR is actually quite broad. It is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, the natural person, take living person, who can be identified, and this is key, directly or indirectly. So someone might hold my car registration number, they might hold my national insurance number or my driving license number, but not my name. But if they've got the right capability and now they're only one step away from that detail of identifying who I am, so all those identification numbers that I listed earlier are therefore, irrespective of whether they have my name, personal data. So if we look at the sheer scope of personal data, and one of the good things that GDPR does is update people's understanding of personal data to include things like genetic and biometric information for the first time, or for example, all those things that get stashed when we browse the web, like our IP address or our mobile device ID. But it's a broad context, moving from left to right, of personal data about a lot of different people. It's not just about our customers, our staff and our suppliers. It's about anyone that our organisation comes into contact with in the conduct of business, or indeed in the wider conduct of corporate affairs. And one thing I often cite for people is think about visitors to your offices or premises, how you maintain a visitor book, what information goes into that, what you do with it afterwards, how long you keep it, and think about a rule for that. Just as one example of the type of person that people might not have thought about how they process their data before. And last but not least, of course, as we all know in this day and age, that data can be anywhere. It can be physical data in our own file stores or out at archive storage. It can be digital data on our file servers or up in the cloud. And of course, it's all that data that sits in the databases of line of business applications. So because we've got that sheer scale of personal data that's out there, it's absolutely essential, I think, to conduct some form of auditing, to maintain some form of inventory, and use wherever possible tools like RPA to discover that data, either when you need to, in responding to a subject request, or when you're getting your holistic inventory style view of your personal data that enables you to have the insight you require. And my last slide touches on that, about particularly the importance of maintaining an inventory. And if we look in the middle, we've got the headlines of the kind of thing that we need to discover. So just going down, it's the categories of data subject, those types of people that we maintain personal data about, the categories and sources of what data we maintain about them, the purposes of processing, both from business rationale, but also going back to the legal basis of processing that we identified in Article 6. And all these things are stated, for example, in Article 30 and elsewhere in the GDPR as being part of the record that organisations should maintain. We need to understand what data is shared, how and why, with whom. We need to know the time limits for erasure mapped to our information assets, what the retention policies are. And last but not least, we need to know what protective measures we have in place, both in terms of technical organisational security and also business continuity. And what that gives us, moving to the right-hand side of the slides, is a number of really good things. First of all, having this kind of inventory is a large and core part of being able to maintain and produce our GDPR Article 30 records of processing activities. Similarly, a lot of this information is what we need to provide when we update our consent forms and our privacy notices. Thirdly, by knowing what we've got where in what format, it enables us to respond to those data subject requests and rights. Fourthly, By understanding what personal data is used where and how, it enables us to prioritize where we might need to look for data protection by design and default, and undertake and maintain data protection impact assessments. The fifth point is a lot of data we do share, as I've said, but we don't always necessarily have sharing agreements in place, and if we do, they're not necessarily containing all the information that they should under GDPR. So it gives us an opportunity to identify where information is shared and make sure that our sharing agreements reflect GDPR compliance. And last but not least, undertaking this kind of exercise is really good for risk management, particularly for example, in identifying where there are security, business continuity, and other information-related risks. So that's my last slide. Thank you for listening. And what we're going to do next is go into another poll question. So I'll hand back to Teresa.
Well, thank you. And do stick around. There's a whole lot more to come, because we're going to be shifting our conversation to talk a little bit about the second half of our topic of how robotic process automation can assist you with this very important task. And so when we were planning for this, we decided we wanted to query everybody in the audience members, so please come back to your keyboards. And we want to know how many robots are you using today for GDPR compliance? Are you using more than 500, more than 250? More than 100, more than 25 robots, or none that you're aware of, or you just don't know. And so we're just trying to gauge a level of understanding of where you are in your journey with using RPA to assist you with GDPR, because that's going to help Dermot as he talks a little bit more in just a moment about all of to explain this further to you. So just want to give you a second to answer that question there. And Dermot, if you'd come back and join us on the line here, and let's take a look at these results.
Sure, Teresa. And we're interested to hear.
And showing here that a few people are using a few bots. Most of the people don't. I believe that 63% are none that they know of, and 34% don't know if their organization is employing RPA for GDPR.
Okay, so yeah, that's extremely interesting. I had expected more, actually, but I think it reflects the fact that for many people, RPA is a relatively new topic, even though that technology has been available for some time, and the intersection between RPA and GDPR compliance is one that maybe is just starting to be made by the audience. And so perhaps then I'll just move on and address that topic of what role RPA indeed can play, and perhaps some of us in the audience then can take this away for consideration within your organizations.
Oh,
and
certainly.
to put it very simply, RPA is a software technology that automates or can automate for you, if you deploy it, a reliable response to GDPR requests. So when you receive any of these requests, and we listed them earlier and I discussed them briefly, GDPR software robots can be used to provide access to information and data for anyone who needs it, to inform people of what's held and how it's being used, to rectify where there are corrections required or completions needed, to erase where data needs to be deleted, and to provide portability where personal data that is held must be shared out with the person to whom it relates, such that they can then have portability and bring that perhaps to their other potential financial services provider. Important to also stress that these GDPR software robots can be used for this purpose no matter where the data resides, and that's why in the right-hand side here you're seeing lots of different formats surrounding this population of robot workers who are going to be out doing your GDPR compliance tasks. The data can be in structured formats, such as regular databases, or it can be in Excel files sitting on desktop machines. It can be in your regular in-house legacy systems like ERP systems or CRM systems. But robots can access information not only in those structured forms, but also in unstructured formats. Sometimes you hear this called cognitive robotics in the marketplace today. And unstructured formats can be things like paper documents, perhaps that have arrived in your mailroom or on your desk directly, or digital images of documents that have arrived, whether they arrived attached to an email or maybe they went through your scanning center. Robots can access information from both structured and unstructured sources, and therefore really can be your hero when you get some of these requests coming in. Let me walk through an example just to try to make this a little bit more real, and imagine that the two people you see on the left of your screen here are customers or constituents, or somehow you're there serving them. Let's call them Mike and Sarah, and they make a request for information, asking what personal data do you hold on them. Maybe they want it just so they know what's there, or maybe they want it for portability reasons, whatever. The first thing to note is that they are likely to make this request across multiple channels. So a multi-channel capability in your business is important. They may call your call center. They may send an email to your inquiries at email address, for example. They may, on a mobile device or a workstation or a laptop, they may go to your website or to a portal that you expose to customers. Or they may be old-fashioned and they may write you a letter and print it and put it in the postal mail, and so it may arrive. Imagine these requests have arrived. What do you do? Well, firstly, of course, you have to be able to recognize that these are requests. These are GDPR requests, and there's a range of ways you can automatically recognize it's a GDPR request. So I'll come back to that a little later. But you then need to, on the right-hand side, go to those many different types of sources, whether it's databases, emails, in-house systems, or perhaps even third-party systems where you've outsourced some of your organizational work to a BPO provider, and they indeed are a business partner of yours. They are holding personal data, and you are responsible for the data that's held there, and you must have access to it. So how do you access that? Well, you could hire an army of people to, every time you get a request, go and hunt for that information. But this is where robots, software robots, can do the work of that army, and indeed can become an intelligent digital workforce on your behalf. And in the case I'm speaking of here, we've got 6 robots. Each of them is going out to a different source. And indeed, those sources can be in multiple different formats, inside and outside your organization. And they essentially are navigating through those information sources, looking for Mike and Sarah, looking for the identifying information. And this would be input to each of those robots. And they're simply then going and trawling for that information. Now, they're trawling for it in a very fast and efficient way that no human workforce could do, because they work at hyperspeed, faster than humans. They work 24/7, 365 days a year, and they never make an error. They're entirely reliable in the inquiries they submit. Now, in this example, what's the result? Well, the result is that much more quickly than we would otherwise have been able to, we're able to, in this case, retrieve information, so that within seconds rather than hours or days, we've gathered the personal data that Mike and Sarah have requested. But robots can do more than that. And while we're showing this simple example for illustration, if this were a request for rectification, then robots can also not only retrieve, but they can correct information. So let's say the middle name or the address or the birth date or something of Mike or Sarah is wrong, and their request is a request to rectify, then that can automatically be done by the robot. So it's more than retrieval. It's also updating and correcting. It can also be deleting. So if this were a request for erasure, these same robots, or perhaps their brother or sister robot, could go out and delete information. Perhaps an old address needs to be deleted. They can do that also. Again, simply managing the universal store of personal data, over which by GDPR you must establish, good governance and management processes. And there's one further thing I wanted to mention that these robots can do. They can also pull this data into some reporting format so that if it's a right to portability, and what Mike and Sarah have asked for is that you provide them the data such that they can take that personal data and bring it to other financial services providers, for example. Then robots can create documents. They can reformat data that's held. They can put it into those document formats, whether it's a PDF document or an Excel format, and then they can issue that out to Mike and Sarah for their use. So there's huge potential here to reply to multiple types of GDPR requests and to do so in a highly efficient and reliable form. And the robots can act in two modes. This new intelligent workforce of GDPR software robots can act either in an attended or unattended mode. Attended means entirely automatically. So you could, for example, have a portal that exposes your organization to your customer base. Of course, you would have some security around that, where there'd be login, credentialing, and identity checking before a customer could get through to the portal. But if they were to be able to, then you could provide a selection of GDPR request buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many you want to provide, that would enable Mike and Sarah, in the example we just saw, to make their own GDPR information request. And they themselves would then be triggering that workforce of robots who would then automatically go off and quickly pull back the information or make a correction or whatever that was the appropriate action. So that's called unattended, simply because there's no employee in your organization who's interacting with the robot. But you can also have these robots operate in what's called attended mode. And the photograph top left shows you someone who's an employee of your organization. They may be in a call or customer response center, and they may be on the telephone with Mike and Sarah and saying, yep, sure, we'd be happy to do that for you. They may then in person go through a conversation in which identity is checked, and they then may, this employee, they themselves may click the button to start the robot that then goes off and looks for Mike and Sarah's data in order to, for example, rectify an incorrect address. So RPA can be, in this way, your attended and unattended robotic workforce to be your GDPR hero and enable you very cost effectively and quickly to comply by reliably and accurately responding to these GDPR requests that I've ticked on the left-hand side. It's a very low-cost option, much cheaper than having an army of actual humans doing this, and it's also very quick and very reliable, as I've said. If you're not used to using robots, I imagine you're asking yourself the question if robots are in use today for this kind of purpose, and the answer is, despite the fact that most of you on the phone aren't using robots for this purpose today, robots are being used, and we at Kofax have customers using robots precisely for the purpose of compliance. And here in Europe, one of the largest European banks I've chosen just to relate a story on are using Kofax RPA so that they can comply rapidly and reliably to compliance requirements across multiple critical processes. I've cited several here. Know Your Customer and AML are well-known regulations, particularly in the financial services, but also in other industries. And in this case, this Kofax customer has managed to reduce the time and cost of compliance by over 90%. So what should you look for when you're thinking of using robots for compliance? I thought it would be helpful, especially since so few of you are already using robots for this purpose, to call out some of the key things to look for. Firstly, you need robots that are simple and fast to build and deploy, and that can work in an agile deployment mode. For those who aren't using robots, and for the almost 90% of you in the instant poll earlier who aren't yet fully prepared, what you need is a RPA technology that allows you to get robots out there working very quickly to help you comply to these requests and avoid the fines that non-compliance might entail. Secondly, you need robots that can access any content, any personal data, anywhere and in any format, whether that's a structured or an unstructured format. You also need, and this is a very important point about enterprise management and operations, you need a robotic workforce that can work at scale. Our experience is that many organizations have dipped their toe in the use of robots and then managed to, after a while, realize that actually the robotic technology they're using is not fit for global large-scale enterprise usage. And when you ramp up the number of requests and the amount of personal data that must be accessed is, of course, huge. You need to be very careful that the robotic technology you choose works at scale. For example, using server-side management of the robotic workforce in an efficient way. And last but not least, so that you can have those attended robots, you must be able to have a RPA technology that can not only be used by people who might initiate robots from call centers, but that can also be to a substantial extent built and maintained by business staff who may be somewhat IT savvy but aren't fully fledged IT professionals. So before moving to Q&A, I wanted to touch on one other topic briefly about how you can design for compliance up front so that you're not in reactive mode, as both I and Reynold have mentioned earlier. And personal data is arriving every day to your organization, and it's arriving in high volumes. It may be arriving as paper in a mailroom. It may be arriving as emails, where the email body or some document that's attached to the email contains personal data. And indeed, you're creating distillations, let's say, of personal data every day as well. Every time you send something out to a customer, you're sending out and probably creating a record of what it is that you send. It could be a letter, it could be an email. So you're distilling personal data by creating and sending information as well. And so the first piece of advice we'd provide is that you go paperless, firstly. But secondly, and that's simply by using technology to digitize inbound paper and eliminating paper repositories and moving to digital documents and storage. But secondly, we suggest moving beyond paper so that only electronic records pass through your business processes. Printing, and even when it gets to things like signatures, move to electronic signatures, because as soon as you allow yourself to contemplate paper that requires a wet signature, as it's called, you're automatically into the analog world and you're raising your risk of not being quite sure or being able to access personal data. Second point, you can achieve privacy by design and compliance by default. So there is technology, and we indeed provided at Kofax, that allows you to automatically, from any of these inbound pieces of information, to automatically extract information and create metadata so that it's easy to find that personal data later on. And one last point, you can, for inbound information, let's say for a document that's attached to an email, you can automatically redact information. So as you see on right, redaction is where you black out or obscure so that it cannot be seen or used or accessed certain pieces of information. So you may not want to have that personal ID number or that credit card number, and you can redact and remove that data at the point of ingestion. So this is what we mean by designing for compliance up front, compliance by default and privacy by design. Commonly in the marketplace today, the technology that helps you do all that I've spoken of on this page is called capture technology. But interestingly, in the RPA world, you'll sometimes hear the term cognitive. So cognitive RPA sometimes is the term used for this. And this technology, commonly called capture, sometimes called cognitive RPA, is one of the core strengths of Kofax. Alongside our RPA technology, and these together with other technologies in our portfolio, we know our customers already are using to ensure they're cost effective and compliant business processes. So without further ado, I want to thank you for your attention today and participation so far. It's now time to move to questions. And Teresa, perhaps you could come back in and lead us through some Q&A before we end today.
Most certainly. And there's just a bit of information up on the screen here, and these links are also in the resources section. We've been listening to Dermot McCauley of Kofax, and before that, Reynold Lemming of Inform You Solutions. A lot of fabulous information has been shared. A lot of questions are coming in, and I know we're going to run a little bit long today, and so I'm going to do my best to get to as many of the questions as we can, but I just know right now we're not going to get to all of them because there are so many questions coming in, and we'll do our best to follow up with you afterwards as well, but also to join the discussion at community.aim.org, and there's also a special interest group at community.aim.org/GDPR to also discuss GDPR-related issues. And also, one other thing to mention real quickly here, AIM and Kofax have teamed up, and AIM has authored a book on GDPR and how robots can help comply. We'll be getting this, the paper should be finished within the next week or so, and we will be inviting you to download that paper when that is ready. So know that we're going to be sending you some more resources about this as well. So I'm going to get to Dermot, and a lot of questions are coming in directly geared towards you. So let me just get to a few of these. Just quickly, you mentioned at the very end the redaction, and someone is just asking for that clarification that redaction is a feature that the robots can work with.
Yeah, sure. Redaction is the task of taking, for example, an inbound letter that might be received from a customer, and the letter may include a credit card number or a social security or government ID number, and redaction is simply the scoring out of that so that it's not visible and not usable by any system, and that can be done by robotic process automation technology in combination with what I've called capture technology. Those two are integrated by us here at Kofax, and it's one of our distinctive strengths. So that redaction can be done by the combination of RPA and capture technology. Good question. What's next, Teresa?
Up here. Wanted to ask of Reynold real quickly, and here someone's asking about what should be maintained within the ROPA record under the Article 30 of GDPR. You touched on that a little bit, and just wanted to, because they're asking a little bit more clarification on.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the key things relate to describing the information assets, which I listed in my last slide. Two main other things, both controllers and processors who have to maintain records have to maintain things like their contact details, who their data protection officer is as well. And one of the key things for processors where you are acting as a processor is also and the law says it's maintain the categories of processing carried out on behalf of each controller. So you basically got to identify the different types of outsourced work you do and maintain, in essence, customer lists against those different processing activities as part of your record. So that's the answer. But it's all nicely laid out in Article 30 of the law.
Okay, thank you. Dermot, someone's asking, what should their CIOs do to start the process to investigate using RPA?
It's a great question. Our experience is that the best way to start is to talk to someone like Kofax. We can help you identify target areas where robotics are most likely to be well applied. There are different types of technology available to automate processes, and there are some processes that are particularly well suited, and we can help you identify those and prioritize them such that then you can deploy robots quite quickly in order to gain some experience taking a relatively simple business process that is highly manual today, expensive to do, but simply by inspecting it you can tell that it's a such a routine, always repeated the same way kind of task that it is a waste of a person to have them repeatedly doing that task. Those are typical hallmarks of kind of early wins in robotic process automation deployment. There are plenty of forums and places on the web because there's lots of interest in RPA. So joining an RPA community is a good thing to do, whether it's on LinkedIn or these kinds of groups. Or as I say, we'd be happy to help if you just like to reach out to us, send us an email. We'd be happy to guide you in that.
Yes. Just want to touch on a couple of things. Several different questions are coming in here where people are looking for resources, training, things like that. Let me just mention a couple of things here for everybody's offerings. Yes, in addition to this fabulous ebook that is coming out, AIM training. We offer live instructor-led training as well as online self-paced courses. You can thoroughly immerse yourself with these deep dive courses or just do quick studies. And they're on a variety of different topics. And we can even arrange for our trainer to come to your place of business and provide custom perspective to our instructor-led training programs. Those can be 2 or 4 day programs. And all of that info can be found at aim.org/training. And reach out there, and someone will gladly answer all of your questions there from our training team. Other resources, as Dermot said, that there's online communities. The AIM community is a fabulous resource for all things capture-related RPA process improvement. The AIM community is very robust, and a lot of conversations take place there daily. So come over there and ask your questions, and your colleagues and peers are answering that, and there's a lot of fabulous advice and opportunity in there. So that's at community.aim.org. Also at aim.org/research, there's AIM's in-depth coverage with our industry market intelligence research reports that go out, and that statistical research that we have there. There's also a wealth of articles, ebooks, case studies, tip sheets, a wide variety of educational materials there. So again, go to the AIM website. The resources is the tab at the top, and certainly many webinars that we offer, upcoming ones, as well as there's a minimum of a 2-year library of webinars in there. So a lot of great places to come and learn more about RPA, GDPR, all of these very pressing issues that are at the forefront for all of us right now. And so,
Teresa, Dermot here. I'm just reviewing the list of questions, and there's several. Maybe I could answer with one. Some people are asking about RPA in combination with other technologies and processes where you need a human to intervene in the middle, perhaps, of an RPA task. And someone asking about RPA and is it the same as BPM? And you will, in an attended robot situation, you'll sometimes want a person to be involved at the beginning, the end, and several times in the middle as the robot is doing multiple tasks along the way to unearth personal data and maybe scrub it and ask a human what to do next, for example. And so many people are coming to us and asking whether, in addition to robotics with capture technology for cognitive RPA, whether robots alongside other process technologies like BPM is something that is used, and we're increasingly seeing that as the robotic understanding of robots matures, as a request we get. So putting RPA along with BPM and with capture technology, we are increasingly seeing demand for that. Those are technologies that we at Kofax have, and indeed we've worked to pre-integrate those technologies to save our customers the time and effort of doing so. But as understanding evolves about what robots can and can't do and what other technologies are required alongside them, we've seen increasing demand, and several of our questions allude to that. So, Teresa, I realize we're short on time now. I'll just pass back to you for
and actually,
winding up the call. Thank you.
Another one, and even Reynold, if you can step in this, I got to squeeze this next one in. What happens when someone's request for that right to be forgotten, to have their data eliminated, conflicts with the records retention rule, say they need to keep that that piece of data or contract or whatever for 7 years, 10 years, whatever.
Yeah.
What happens when that is in conflict?
Well, the right to be forgotten isn't an automatic thing where it just has to be executed if someone makes the request. And as with all parts of GDPR, there's lots of exceptions to this. Typically where someone can make the request and be guaranteed it will happen is when the only basis upon which that data is processed is because they've given their consent and they withdraw their consent. So, for example, certain types of marketing data. But this is why on slide 2 it's important to run through the legal basis of processing. You may well and often will have valid reasons for retaining data longer because it's part of the contract, because you've got a legal obligation to do so, because it's in the best interests of the things you're doing for that citizen that you need to process that data. So that's the answer, that actually if you've got a well-written retention schedule and your process for answering data subject requests builds in the exceptions, you'll be able to handle that request in the appropriate way.
Thank you. And we really do need to end our webinar right now. Don't forget to download the resources. You can get one of those links as a PDF to the slide presentation in there. Also some great links from Kofax in there. Get some more information from them. Also, please take the survey that's going to open or click the link in the widgets. I value your feedback. Very much want to thank our underwriter, Kofax. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM would not be able to bring you these free educational programs. So thank you, Kofax, for sponsoring our webinar today. As we do bring this webinar to a close, I just want to leave everyone with our speakers' closing thoughts or key takeaways from today. So I'm going to begin first with Dermot McCauley from Kofax. Your closing thoughts today.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, firstly, I want to thank everyone for joining. It's been great to see so much interest and attention. I guess my thoughts are, GDPR compliance is urgent. Requirements are stringent. Penalties for non-compliance are large. Only 12% of you were fully prepared, you felt. That means 90% aren't. Only 62% of you said none. No robots are in use. I hope we've helped you understand the potential of robots. Speed is of the essence here. So I hope that we've given you some education, given you some thoughts, and we'd be happy if you are interested in getting more help with this. Our purpose is to offer that to you. So again, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Dermot. And Reynolds Lemming of Inform You Solutions, your closing thoughts today.
I echo Dermot. Thanks ever so much, everyone, for your time, and have a good rest of the day. Just a couple of things I want to end on. First of all, I just want to say that actually I think GDPR is a very good thing. GDPR is certainly good for us as individuals, particularly as global digital citizens, because it means no matter who we give our data to, no matter where it travels around the world, it should be looked after. And equally, GDPR is good for businesses because I think good practice in privacy can be worn like a badge of honor in the same way that ISO 9001 or 14001 are. And last of all, if you're still looking at trying to prioritize things to be done as the clock is ticking, in addition to looking at RPA technology from a purely governance perspective, have a look at all the personal data you hold and try and make sure that you've got an up-to-date records retention schedule that takes account of it all. Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone, I greatly appreciate your time today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you on our next webinar. And have a very good day.